The dust hung heavy over the valley, catching the last light of a dying sun. Sheriff Clay's horse stopped at the ridge, where one man still stood, Jedediah Crane, the last true rancher of the frontier. His hat shadowed his eyes, but the fire behind him burned brighter than the flames eating through his barn below. The sheriff raised his voice. "It's over, Jed." Silence. Then came the answer, quiet but thunderous. "You can hang me, Sheriff, but you'll never take my land." In that moment, everyone watching understood, a man can lose everything, except his soul. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The ridge drank the dying sun and spat it back in copper and flame as Jedediah Crane stood with his boots dug into the heart. Old earth, the barn behind him an altar of fire and memory, heat licking the sky, smoke knitting the clouds into a bruised forehead. He held his rifle not as a weapon but as an extension of a lifetime's work, knuckles white, shoulders squared, a man whose hands remembered every nail driven, every calf studded, every promise made under a different sun. The valley below seemed to hush itself out of respect or fear, wind holding its breath so that the crackle of burning timbers and the soft, animal noises of cattle driven to the far fence were the only chorus, and in that hush every small sound read like an accusation. Sheriff Clay had dismounted at the crest with deputies spread like a slow shadow behind him. The sheriff's hat was low, his face a geography of lines carved by law and old choices. When he called Jed by name, his voice was careful, the kind that had broken other men and tried, each time, to mend what it had broken. "It's over, Jed," he said, and the words were legal and simple and terrible in their finality. A warrant, a paper, a line drawn where a life had been. Jedediah looked at him as if seeing an old portrait only now finished. No firelight could warm the chill that passed between them, because what stood there was not only two men but every unspoken history they were both carrying like stones in their pockets, battles fought in younger bodies, debts paid in sweat and blood, loyalties folded away for the convenience of peace. He remembered his father's hands, the way the old man would cup a seed of grass and say, "This is where we belong," and the way a child believes such promises as if they were gospel. Memory slid over him now like heat over metal, searing, clarifying, and he tasted the tar of smoke and the salt of his own fear and pride. In Jet's chest the land was not a commodity. It was a ledger of names and births and funerals, a language taught by plow and fence in the slow, stubborn growth of oak. To surrender it would be to unright his father and his son still unborn, to hand strangers the right to rename what had always answered to their family's footfall. Sheriff Clay's eyes flicked to the barn and back again. And for the first time in years the sheriff looked small, not because his badge was lighter but because the weight of history made him so. He had a job to do, the letter in his coat pocket boring for authority and the tremor of a governor's pen. And yet his mouth tightened, an unvoiced question lodged there. Which law is truer, the one on paper or the one that keeps a man from becoming less than he is? The deputy shifted, one spat into the dust to fill the space where words might have been. Another fingered the butt of his gun as if to remind the world which shape power prefers. The camera of memory, if there were such a thing, would cut close to Jet's weathered face. His eyes were two wells, rimmed with ash, reflecting the barn's fury as if the fire burned inside him. His jaw ticked with the rhythm of a man counting out his reckoning. He remembered Martha's laugh at dawn, the way the porch light would wink like an old coin when the night was done. And he thought of the children who had run across these pastures, their voices braided into the fences like wild vine. He let silence answer Clay's plea. In that silence was the slow burn of defiance, the heavy, stubborn poetry of a man who had learned to measure value not by coin but by the depth of root and the length of a family's story. He raised his chin a fraction, and when he spoke it was quiet enough to be a prayer and loud enough to be a verdict. "You can hang me, Sheriff, but you'll never take my land." The words fell like a bell in the valley, simple, final, ringing with the rhythm of someone who had already begun to accept the cost, and around them the world rearranged itself. Deputies bristled, the sheriff's mouth formed and reformed a dozen replies that never crossed the line between law and mercy. The wind shifted so ash sifted like gray rain across Jet's boots, and in that kept silence every watcher felt the shape of what was to come. The morning held a hush like a held breath, Jedediah Crane moved through it with the slow certainty of a man who had long ago learned the language of land and livestock. His boots scuffing familiar dust, his shadow stretched thin and honest across the pasture. He tended to the herd as if tending to a congregation, chucking eyes, soothing flanks, murmuring soft, broken names learned across decades. His hands were stories, knuckles thick with years, palms like well-worn maps that remembered every fence post and gate. And he spoke to his old mare, Daisy, as if she were kin, fingers running the curve of her withers, voice low and rough with affection. "Daisy, keep them steady." And Daisy answered in breath in the gentle sway of her head, a companion in weather and in waiting. Jed moved as someone out of time, his clothes the faded, patched uniform of a life spent under sun and storm, his speech the slow punctuation of a man who believes that patience and stubbornness are virtues, not stubbornness alone. And he repaired a paling with the same care one would give a letter, each hammer blow a small benediction. He walked the line of the fence, touching each post the way a preacher might touch a Bible, naming the boards and the nails in the place where his father had carved a child's tally into the wood, letting memory rise around him like the scent of cut hay and warm leather, because every small thing belonged. The leaning willow by the creek that shaded a favorite spring, the stone piled near the corral carved with initials long softened by rain, the path the calf swore to the far refuge during summer lightning, all pieces of a ledger that measured a life in roots. In the kitchen a kettle sang, a ragged broom leaned where it always did, a child's boot hollowed the floor where little feet had run, and Jed paused at the threshold and looked out, thinking of all the ordinary mornings that had stitched his world together. Feed, mend, walk, pray, sleep, repeat, and the quiet gratitude of it pooled in his chest like honey. He was not blind to change. He'd ridden into towns where talk of rails and fortune smelled as sweet and dangerous as moonshine, but he believed some things were not for sale. The hollow where a man buried his name, the stretch of pasture where a woman had once laughed until the horses turned their heads. As he worked he felt the land like a pulse under his palms, the morning's light keeping time with that pulse, and he hummed an old, wordless tune and let his mind collect the small comforts, a cup of coffee hot enough to sting the tongue, the damp smell of saddle leather, the soft nick of a colt's nose against his hand. Then, far out, a dust cloud rose with arrogant speed like a bruise forming in the sky, moving with the liveliness of rumor that becomes fact all at once. Jed stopped mid-reach, the halter slack in his hands, and listened as the distant thunder of hoofs spelled out a new sentence. Riders. He had time to feel a swell of something like dread, slow and precise, the kind a man learns to name after losing much and keeping what little remained. Then, as if a curtain had been pulled back, memory flashed, his father's hand striking hard at a stubborn nail, a child's sunburned face. The lullaby Martha hung when rain tapped the roof. Jed did not run. Instead he set the halter carefully over Daisy's head, tied a knot he knew would hold, and walked toward the low rise to see who would bring the dust, whether it would carry a neighbor's saddle, the clink of a merchant's promise, or the black ink of a claim. The morning that brought Sheriff Clay to Jedediah Crane's gate smelled of iron and diesel before either existed, as if the future had ascended and it rode in on a folded piece of paper. Clay dismounted with the careful manners of a man who carries authority like a tired coat, neat, necessary, a little worn at the elbows, and in his hand was the letter that would unmake what had been stitched together by calloused fingers and patient seasons. The governor's seal pressed to ink the commanded lines on a map as if land were a ledger and men were items to be checked off. Jed watched him come up the lane, the sheriff's spokes raising small ghosts of dust that blew over the fence posts Jed knew by name, and when Clay spoke his voice was even, practiced, but it carried a softness Jed had not heard in years. "Crane, I've got orders," and the words landed like a cold wind in a house with a living room full of photos. Clay read from the page because law likes to be read aloud as if that made it kinder. The railroad needed a right-of-way. Eminent domain had been invoked. Compensation would be arranged. The deputies stood behind him like punctuation marks, stationed and expectant. The clear shapes of law in a soft world of smoke and grass. Jed's hands were steady as he put down his pitchfork and walked slowly to the gate. His fingers closed on the wood as if feeling the grain could reroute fate. He had been up most of the night watching the barn, thinking of how a man keeps store of small things. A trough, an old nail, a story, that make up a life. Clay's eyes flicked to the barn then back to Jed. and for a breath the sheriff's face lost its official geometry and took on a private map of lines made by years of choices, some made for duty and some made for old friends. He tried then, in the middle of a prairie no law could smooth over, to make the hard soft. Jed, it ain't personal. The town needs the rail. Progress, you know. Jed's mouth twisted. He could hear the thin, polite echo of a city man who charted rails without ever smelling the manure of a cattle drive. He answered without heat but with the pressure of something older than argument. You can't buy what was earned in blood. The words were not a plea. They were a ledger closed and hammered shut. The deputies glanced away as if looking at another man might scratch the varnish off their certainty. One of them, younger, stared at the ground where a boot print had already begun to flatten into dust. The kind of man who learns to obey before he learns to ask why. Clade took a step forward and the sun threw his shadow long across the yard, a dark line that tried to bisect man from man but found only more ground. He put the letter back in his coat, his fingers lingering on the paper like a mourner lingering at a grave. He spoke then of law and order, of obligations he could not ignore without losing the thing that made him sheriff, and his voice carried the shape of a man trying to obey a contract with his conscience. Jed listened in his eyes, those wells the valley knew, filled with a dry light. He thought of his father swinging a hammer on this very ridge, of his mother's song when the baby slept in the lean-to, of the oath he'd made in youth to never sign his name away for a silver smile. This land's the ledger of my life, he said, and the sentence was a kind of prayer and a judgment both, the rhythm of language that has weathered many winters. Around them the cattle shifted uneasily, as if they understood better than men sometimes do. Land remembers. Clay's jaw set, a crease cut his face where duty and memory met. He had ridden into towns that cheered the coming rails, saw factories that spat smoke like new gods, and yet here, standing before a man who held ghosts like witnesses, he felt the old claim of kinship pulled him. He had, once, been younger than the law and had bled for reasons that weren't written down. The deputies shuffled, the atmosphere tightened. In the hush, the valley listened and the world leaned toward a choice, paper or root, ink or blood, and the question settled in the space between two men who had once shared bread and now stood on opposite sides of an invisible fence. Sunlight once moved through this place like a benediction, and Jedediah Crane could still measure the hours by the way his father's hammer sang against fresh timber. The bright, clean notes of a building that belonged to hope rather than loss. In that memory the world smelled of cut pine and sweat and soap on hands, and boys ran with cheeks flushed, shirts plastered to backs, and Jed's small hand found his father's calloused palm as if to anchor himself to something that would not waver. His father's laugh was broad and steady, a drumbeat of certainty as he set the first corner post into the earth and taught us on the geometry of fences and promises, saying, "This is ours, Jed, mark it with your name." And the boy, earnest and stubborn, pressed his small blade into wood and carved a crooked initial that would forever be a claim against forgetting. They worked from dawn to dusk, the sun lowering like a slow metronome as nails found wood and beams took breath beneath the sky. Neighbors bringing pies and gossip and the warm, soft weight of community. Everyone's small labors braided into a single rising thing. Barn, bunkhouse, a lean-to for calves, spaces that learned to hold laughter and thunder in the hush of funerals. Jet's father would pause sometimes, hand on a hip, eyes sweeping the land as if he could drink it in and keep it in. He told stories of their ancestors, of a named ridge where a forebear had once sworn an oath to stay. The language of belonging taught not through law but through bread and toil, and the child who would be Jed absorbed that language like air, believing as naturally as breath that land is inheritance and duty combined. There was a night after the building when his father sat by the new fence and rolled a cigarette with slow, practiced fingers and looked at his son in that way men who planned to be remembered do, soft but firm, and Jed, small and trembling with the weight of a promise he did not yet understand, said, "Pa, I swear I'll never sell it." And the vow fell between them like a stone that would sink deep into soil in time. Years later the carved initial would become a map of all the little losses and gains a family keeps, scars on posts where weather bit, a notch to mark the day a calf was born, a painted heart where a girl once tied a ribbon, and every one of those small markers fed the story that made the land more than acreage. It became chronicle, it became epitaph and cradle both. Memory stitches itself into the present with quiet persistence, so when the sky above the ridge darkened and the barn's red first showed on the horizon, a sound like the past answering an alarm, the two times, then and now, crowded into one. Jed felt it not as a clean cut between what was and what is, but like two hands laid on the same table, one calloused and warm, the other ash-covered and shaking. The hammer's bright note in his childhood folded into the long, dull crackle of burning beams, laughter that had once filled the loft mixed with the animal, terrified cries as stock scattered in smoke, and the scent of pine and sweat was swallowed by soot and the metallic tang of panic, Yet's memory of the promise. His small voice, steady against his father's larger laughter, became a backbone against which present terror leaned. Every ember that fell from the barn carried with it a memory of hands holding fast, and with every collapse of rafter Jed felt the centuries of his family's small labors reel as if stripped from a ledger. Grief arrived slow and precise, not the swift, dramatic thing some imagine, but the patient kind that settles into the joints and turns thought into grit. Duty, taught with a hammer, and a father's gray voice rose in him like muscle memory. Do not surrender what is not yours to trade. In the smoke his father's silhouette returned to him, a broad-shouldered man standing atop a newly built ridge, hand shading his eyes, giving the land its name by living on it. Jed could see the young boy he had been there beside him, the initials carved into posts like a covenant. Now, faced with men who counted value in rails and ink, he held that covenant like a relic against the heat. The past did not merely inform him, it fortified him, turning sorrow into a kind of resolve that was quieter and older than rage. The present and the past braided into a single rope of obligation, and Jed stood with the rope in his hands, feeling every strand, every fingerprint, every quiet promise, and he knew then that whatever the law might claim, whatever the rail might want, there was a ledger no paper could touch, blood and labor written in wood and soil, and for that line drawn in the scar of his family's life he would answer. Night settled heavy over Dust Valley, the kind of night that pressed against windows and walls until even the lamps seemed to flicker out of shame. And in the small sheriff's office at the heart of town, Clay sat alone with a bottle, a paper, and the low hum of regret that had followed him most of his life. The warrant lay open before him, its edges curled like something scorched, the governor's signature shining under lamplight as if mocking him with its authority. And Clay stared at it the way a soldier stares at a spent bullet, aware it has already done its work, yet unable to throw it away. His hand hovered over the page, fingers trembling not from the whiskey but from memory, for the name written there, Jedediah Crane, was not a stranger's name. It was a ghost, a brother in arms, a man who had once pulled Clay out from under a hail of bullets in the border wars when men fought over lines that no mapmaker could keep straight. And now, years later, the law demanded that same loyalty be repaid with a noose. The lamplight cut across the room, catching the dust floating above old files and worn boots, turning every mote into a reminder of time's quiet cruelty. He poured another drink, the liquid catching amber fire, and whispered into the silence, why did it have to be him? A question that held no answer, only the tired echo of his own voice bouncing off the tin star pinned to his chest. In that silence, he heard the war again. The crack of rifles, Jed's shout calling him to move, the smell of blood and dirt, and afterward, Jed laughing over the campfire, saying, we ain't dying for a flag, Clay. We're dying so something worth keeping might live. That line, simple and raw, had never left him. It now mocked every word printed on that warrant. He ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of stubble loud in the still room, and stared at the badge gleaming on his vest. It felt heavier than iron. It felt like a chain. Outside, the town slept easy under the soft promise of progress. The saloon quiet, the church candles guttered, but Clay knew sleep was no mercy. It was avoidance, and tonight, avoidance had come to collect its neck. The door creaked open and Deputy Willis stepped in, young and earnest, the kind of man who still believed law was a clean thing. His voice was cautious but insistent. Sheriff, the governor's orders came through clean. The rail's paying good money for that land. Law's law. The words dropped like stones in a still pond, breaking the fragile quiet. Clay didn't look up, just swirled his glass, watching the amber spin like time circling a drain. And after a long moment he said softly, law's law, Haw. Funny how that never feels the same when it's your own neck under the rule. The deputy shifted, uncertain, glancing toward the door as if the moral weight might follow him out into the night. But Clay's silence pinned him there. The sheriff stood, slow and deliberate, walking to the window where the moon painted the dusty street silver, and then, The same road he and Jet had ridden as boys, chasing stray cattle in wild dreams before the world decided who'd be law and who'd be outlaw. He felt the years like gravel under his boots, each one a choice, a compromise, a wound hidden under the cloth of duty. He whispered, almost to himself, "I gave this town peace. Judd gave it blood. Seems like one of us deserves better than this." The deputy didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know how. Clay turned back to the desk, folded the warrant, and slid it into his coat pocket as if concealing sin could make it smaller. He blew out the lamp, letting darkness flood the room, and the last thing visible was his badge catching the faint light from the street, a glint of authority over a hollow chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and tired and human. "Law's law, boy. But men like Jed, men who bled for dirt and promise, they're the reason we've got a law to break." The bottle emptied, the night held its breath, and Sheriff Clay sat back down, caught between two ghosts, one of duty, one of friendship, both calling his name. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Martha Pike rode into the yard at dawn like a weathered omen, her mare's hoofs punching small, steady holes in the frosted ground while the sky above bled into a gray that promised sun and sorrow both. She rode hard enough that her hair was a riot of wind and straw, her face a map of years spent in sun and storm, and when she slid down from the saddle she did not laugh nor did she waste breath on pleasantries. She came with news, and news in Dust Valley carried the weight of anvils. Jedediah looked up from where he was mending a gate, hands black with tar and callus, and for a moment the morning kept its breath as if listening for how the world would respond. Martha's eyes were sharp as a steely hinge. She tied her mare to the rail and spoke plain, the words falling like coins on wood. "They're coming with the law, Jed, rail hands and deputies. They mean to make an example." The sentence landed in the air, rearranged itself. Judd did not flinch. His hands paused midway and he stared at the horizon where a distant line of dust had already begun to form, a ribbon of movement that might have been wind if it weren't for the human rhythm beating within it. Hooves, wheels, men. Martha leaned on the fence, and for a beat the two of them stood like two old trees sharing the same scar. She had been on this land since before Judd could remember, a woman who learned to read weather in cattle's ears and truth in the way a horse snorted. She had seen men lose things and men lose themselves. Now she saw something older, the slow bureaucratic appetite that chews up homesteads in the name of progress. Jet's jaw tightened. There was no tremor of fear in him, only the steady, patient acceptance of a man who has stacked losses and learned their measure. He moved with deliberate slowness, the kind that makes small actions feel ritual. He hung his tools, checked the latches on the horse stalls, walked the line of his fence with a hand on each post as if to say goodbye to them like old friends, naming them under his breath. Martha watched him and the corners of her mouth went soft. "You don't have to face them alone," she said, and the words were both offer and plea. But Jed shook his head just a fraction and answered not with argument but with the sort of language only worn hands and ears can use. He said, "It's not about being alone." He moved into the house and took from a drawer a ragged bandana, frayed where 1,000 years of sweat and sun had gnawed its edges. It was his father's, the one his father had tied around his neck when the boy was small and the world felt like something that could be held by both hands. Jed folded the cloth with the reverence of a man who knows relics are weaker than memory but still necessary. He tied it around his neck with a knot that would not slip. The bandana sat against his throat like an old promise. Martha handed him a tin cup of coffee, black and bitter and exact, and he took it without ceremony, the steam fogging his breath as if his words might come out written in vapor. "They'll come with men ready to make a show," she said again, voice low like a prayer, "and they'll want more than land. They'll want to break a spirit." Jed closed his eyes briefly, thinking of his father's hands on the small carved initial on the first fence post, thinking of children who had learned to ride between the same trees, thinking of nights when the house smelled of bread and laughter and the world was only a set of ordinary, stubborn joys. Acceptance was not cowardice. It was knowledge of the ledger a man keeps in his chest. He patted Daisy's flank where the mare stood patient as an old sentinel, and then he began to gather the few things he could not bear to leave. A journal, a battered Bible with pages thumbed soft, a photograph with corners bent, each item folded into a saddlebag like promises tucked into pockets for a long journey. Martha watched the ritual with the solemnity of one watching a funeral prepared. She mounted again when he finished, the mare shifting like a slow-breathing machine, and for a moment neither spoke. The valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the dust to arrive and for the shape of what would follow to be revealed. Jed turned to her, steady as an oak in winter, and said, quiet and fierce, if they want to come and hang a name on a nail, let them. But they'll never hang what's in the ground. The words fell and Martha's eyes shone with an old, wet light. She clicked her tongue, urged her mare forward, and rode back toward the ridge to watch the horizon, leaving Jed to steady himself against the house like a man bracing for a storm he has named and is willing to meet. The sky began to darken before the first rider crested the ridge, heavy clouds crawling low like wounded beasts across the valley, smearing the sun into a dull, rust-colored smear that bled into the horizon. And Jedediah Crane stood in the quiet of it, the charged stillness before a storm where even the insects seemed to hold their tongues. The air had that sharp, electric edge that tastes of iron and owen, and somewhere in the distance thunder grumbled like an old judge clearing his throat. Down in the basin, a long, uneven line of riders began to form, a procession of men in metal, the sheriff's badge glinting among them like a coin dropped in the dirt. 30 armed men under Clay's command, faces grim with the barbed conviction of law, their rifles catching what little light the valley offered, the flags of the railroad snapping behind them, carrying the scent of greed and ink and progress paid another man's sweat. Jed stood with his rifle slung across his chest, the wind pulling at his coat, his hat brim dipping low to shadow eyes that had seen too many suns set on better men. He watched them advance in silence, their hoofbeats thick and synchronized, every thud against the earth echoing up through his bones until the rhythm became almost musical, a dirge written for soil and pride. In that pounding, steady as a heartbeat, Jed found himself asking the question that had haunted him since his father's death. If land ain't worth dying for, then what is a man worth living for? The thought hung in his mind like a sermon spoken to no one but the wind, and its answer, wordless, inevitable, settled behind his ribs. He remembered his father's voice teaching him how to mend fences, saying that a man who builds something with his hands leaves behind a language others can't rewrite. And he thought of how the law could seize the deed, burn the barn, salt the fields, but they could not take the meaning of what had been lived here. The storm above grumbled deeper, closer, a growl now, rolling across the open, and the first drops began to fall, fat and slow, carving trails through the dust on Jed's boots. The riders kept coming, their shapes dark and slick under the coming rain, their banners drooping as the wind turned mean. Clay rode at the center, his eyes fixed on the small silhouette of Jed standing alone before the burning husk of what had once been his barn. And for a moment, the sheriff looked less like a lawman and more like a man carrying a coffin he did not wish to bury. Jed watched the faces as they drew nearer, some young, some older, some with eyes that flicked away from him in shame or pity, some set in that flat, expressionless look of those who follow orders because they have no choice or no will to find another. The wind lifted and howled through the valley, carrying ash and the faint smell of rain-soaked smoke, and the old rancher's hair whipped loose around his temples. His horse, Daisy, pawed at the ground, uneasy but loyal, its dark eyes wide, catching the reflection of the fire's dying glow. Thunder cracked, sharp, immediate, alive, and for an instant the world was split into two halves, the men of progress and the men of promise, the paper and the earth, the future and the past, all suspended in that white flash of sound and light. Jed lifted his rifle, not to aim, not yet, but to rest it against his shoulder like a relic of belief, a tool, not a threat. His gaze met Clay's across the widening space, and for a flicker of a second the sheriff saw not a criminal but a mirror, two men who had once believed in the same horizon, now standing on opposite sides of it. The rain began to fall harder, stitching the dust to mud, and the rhythmic beat of hoofs became the steady drum of war. Each step forward from the riders was an erasure of something sacred, each heartbeat in Jed's chest a stubborn refusal to be erased. He breathed deep, felt the sting of wet wind on his face, and whispered under the rumble, "Well, Pa, reckon this is the reckoning." Lightning split the sky then, blinding and brief, and its light flashed on the barrel of Jed's rifle, on the silver badge of the sheriff, and on the endless stretch of land between them. Earth that had soaked up generations of sweat and blood and would now, before this day was done, drink more of the same. The storm gathered above, patient and brutal, and in its silence between rumblings, A man's fate waited. The match struck with a sound too small for the size of the moment, a whisper against the wind that carried the weight of a man's entire life. And in that frail flame, Jedediah Crane saw the shape of everything he'd ever built. The barn, the fences, the sweat-stained years of work, and everything he was about to let burn. The storm still growled overhead, dark clouds pressing down like a low ceiling ready to collapse, and the scent of rain mixed with the dry, powdery smell of hay and dust, of old wood that had waited decades for this reckoning. He crouched near the open doorway of the barn, hands steady though his heart beat a war drum inside his ribs, the flame licking along the matchstick like a tiny promise of freedom. And when he touched it to the straw, the fire caught with a soft sigh, curling and growing, as though it too understood this was not destruction, it was defiance. Flames took to the dry timbers quickly, climbing the walls, racing up the beams where generations of swallows had nested, the orange glow swelling until it was a second sun rising in the darkening world. Heat burst outward in waves that carried the smell of oil and ash, wrapping Judd's face in a wash of light that turned his eyes into small mirrors reflecting the chaos he chose, and every flicker of fire carved lines of story across his skin. And in that light he looked like both martyr and sinner, both builder and destroyer. Behind him the fields stretched wide and waiting, the wind pushing the fire's roar into the open, spreading sparks like stars across the black horizon. Jed stood in its heat and felt the burn on his skin like absolution, his silhouette cutting against the blaze as though carved from the same stubborn will as the land itself. In the distance, the first silhouettes of riders broke the ridge, 30 dark figures under the sheriff's spanner, their formation steady, purposeful, a living machine rolling toward him, rifles gleaming in staccato bursts of lightning. The fire's glow reached them before the sound did, and in that glow Sheriff Clay saw the valley turn red, saw the barn, once the symbol of a man's labor and pride, become an inferno too bright to look at directly. He pulled his horse to a stop and the others followed, uncertainty rippling down the line like a slow tremor. God helped him, one deputy muttered, and Clay said nothing, because he understood what this was, not madness, not desperation, but a statement carved into the earth. You can take everything, but I'll decide how it goes. The rain began to fall harder, but it only hissed against the blaze, unable to quench what was now more than fire. It was a sermon, a revolt, a reclamation of choice. Back at the barn, Jed watched the beams twist and collapse, every groan of wood a farewell. He could see his father's handprints in those planks, could hear his mother humming by the door, could smell the hay from the days when harvest meant hope. He whispered to them now, words lost to the crackle. They won't take it, Pa. Not while I still stand. The flame surged, leaping higher, casting wild shadows across his face as if the ghosts of everyone who had ever worked this soil had come to bear witness. The storm's thunder rolled low, and in the distance, Clay spurred his horse forward, slow but sure, the line of riders following, their boots heavy with the weight of what had to be done. The scene cut between two fates, the sheriff's line advancing through wind and rain, and the solitary figure of Jed before the inferno, a man stripped to essence, his defiance painted in orange and black. His rifle lay across his arm, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the horizon where the law was coming. The wind carried ash between them like a message written by God and answered in gunpowder and faith. For a moment, lightning split the valley wide open, revealing it all at once, the barn collapsing inward, the rider's eyes glinting like flint, the sheriff's face carved in sorrow, the old rancher standing unbroken in the light of his own rebellion. And then darkness returned, thick and absolute, leaving only the hiss of rain and the echo of a fire burning against destiny itself. Clay slid from his saddle with the quiet of a man who has practiced the motion until it no longer startles the world, boots hitting the churned earth in a soft punctuation while the rest of his men stayed mounted like a dark, circling thought. He folded his reins over his arm and walked forward, hat in hand, the badge on his chest catching the firelight and throwing it back like an accusation. And Jedediah Crane watched him come with an old, exacting calm that made the moment feel like the closing of a ledger. Nothing theatrical, no bluster, only the long, small breaths of two men who had once bled under the same sky. Around them the rain hissed and the ash fell like gray confetti, and the riders stood back, a ring of authority and hesitation. Guns halted in holsters as if the leather itself were uneasy to be near such a meeting. Clay's face was a map of decisions made in rooms and at crossroads, and when he reached the line where Jed stood he did not raise his hand. He simply let it hang empty between them. His voice was low and rough, with the kind of pleading that comes when someone has already lost the argument inside his own head. "Jed, don't make me do this." The words were almost a prayer. Jed's answer was a smile that carried the weight of a funeral hymn. It was not a smile of triumph, but of recognition, of the inevitable contract signed long before either man had wanted to read it all out. "You already did when you signed that paper." The paper was a thing that lived now in Clay's coat, inked authority that had the peculiar honesty of bureaucracy. Clean edges, defined purpose, no mercy. In the space between those two sentences, the valley tasted like iron at old promises. The wind stitched them together with threads of smoke and regret. They spoke no more at first. The hush wrapped them like a shawl, and in that hush each man counted the debts he owed. Jed to his father and the barn's bones, Clay to the town and the law he wore like armor. Memory rose in Jed as if summoned by the sheriff's presence. Campfires in younger days when they had split a ration and watched constellations map futures they had not yet learned to fear. Clay remembered Jed's steady hand pulling him to safety once, the way a man becomes more than an oath when he has saved another's skin. The conversation that followed moved with the careful economy of men who knew every word could be a blade. Clay tried then for compromise, for some small mercy. "We can postpone. There's talk of a different route. Give me a day, Jed. Give me time to find another way." His fingers touched the paper in his coat for emphasis and withdrew, as if the document itself might sting his skin. Jed listened, the rain etching little tracks down his face, and he folded his hands around the barrel of his rifle, not to threaten but to steady himself. His voice came on a line between resignation and resolve. "You can look for roads all you want, Sheriff. They'll draw lines until the map forgets names." There was no pleading in it now, only the finality of someone who had leaned on 100 small certainties and watched them begin to give. Clay's mouth opened once as if to say the thing that would humanize paper, some concession of shared past, but the sound of a deputy's shifting weight on his horse cut the air, unwanted and sharp. For a heartbeat the law itself seemed to breathe like a beast, slow, inevitable. The inevitability loosened the edges of their argument and settled a heavier truth on them both, that some things are decided in rooms where men never see the dirt they bargain over, and some debts are older than statutes. Jed's eyes, those deep wells of memory the valley knew, met Clay's, and he saw there, reflected, the sheriff's own youth, the bright certainty that had once guided him, and it hurt him to see that light diminished. "I ain't looking for mercy," Jed said quietly, and the sentence landed like a stone thrown into still water. It made ripples across the faces of the men watching. Some faces hardened further, some went slack with pity. Clay nodded then, once, a slight, private gesture that felt like a benediction and a sentence at the same time. He stepped back, the motion small but monumental, like closing a book on a life one loved and could not save. Around them the world rearranged, deputies shifted to form lines, the riders squared their shoulders, and the sheriff straightened his coat as though to show the paper again to the wind. There was no victory in any of it, only the clean, terrible arithmetic of law meeting roots, and in that meeting both men found their shapes, one of duty, one of devotion, carved against the sky. The inevitability hung, dense as smoke, and the valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next act to begin. The stillness shattered before the thunder could roll again. It happened not with declaration but with a mistake, a twitch of fear masquerading as duty. One young deputy, rain dripping off his hat brim, finger tightening on the trigger as if the weight of the silence itself demanded release, and the rifle cracked open the sky with that merciless report that turns time into splinters. The bullet hit nothing human, slicing through smoke and distance, but it was enough. The air itself broke apart, the horses screamed, and the valley seemed to exhale chaos. Jed moved not with panic but with something older and sharper, instinct toned by a lifetime of tending the living and burying the lost. His body folding low as the first volley of gunfire tore through the rain, shards of wood splintering off the corral post beside him, the smell of gunpowder biting into the smoke of the burning barn. He rose in the rhythm of the storm, rifle steady, his shot a single, clean punctuation mark in the noise. A horse went down in the sheriff's line with a terrible grace, its rider tumbling into the mud, his shout swallowed by the roar. The others answered in kind, bullets finding air and dirt and destiny. But through it all Jed didn't run. He stood his ground, the flames behind him stretching taller, throwing orange and black stripes across the chaos, and each pull of his trigger felt less like an act of war and more like communion. Deliberate, precise, righteous, the kind of defiance that doesn't ask to win but to be remembered. Clay shouted for his men to hold, to cease, his voice cracking against the storm. But the command dissolved in the confusion of horses and men caught between orders and instinct. Thunder cracked overhead as if heaven itself were lending percussion to the destruction below. The wind picked up, tearing through the valley, swirling ash and rain and dust until Cider itself became unreliable, each shape a ghost moving in a blur of light and smoke. Jed reloaded with the calm of a man who had accepted his ending long before the first shot was ever fired. He moved like ritual, fingers sure even as the world dissolved around him. The rifle stock slick with rain and sweat, the rhythm of his breath slow, deliberate, prayerful. He saw Clay through the smoke once, their eyes catching for a half-second, and in that half-second there was recognition, not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to mourning. Clay's face, drawn and haunted, was that of a man realizing the law he carried had become the very gun that would destroy what it was sworn to protect. A second volley came from the deputies, louder now, desperate, trying to pinch it against his own burning walls, and the barn answered with its own death cry as its roof collapsed inward, sending a rush of fire and cinders roaring upward into the rain. Sparks fell around Jed like judgment, glinting in the wet, black mud where brass shells gathered like coins at a preacher's feet. The earth shook with the weight of horses shifting, the men shouting, the wind howling its fractured hymn, and still Jed stood, unmoved, unbroken, his silhouette framed by ruin, a man-made myth by the stubbornness of principle. He whispered to himself, "Hold steady, old man. This here is just the last harvest," and fired again, the sound merging with thunder in such perfect timing it felt ordained. One deputy cried out, his rifle spinning into the dirt, the sound of his pain drowned by the storm that had now claimed everything, vision, sound, reason, until the valley itself was nothing but heartbeat and smoke. Clay forced his horse forward, shouting Judd's name again and again, the words ripped away by wind, and somewhere deep within the storm a kind of truth began to take shape, that what they were fighting for was no longer a piece of land, nor a principle of law, but the very right to choose what would define them in the end, paper or promise, obedience or soul. Jet's rifle barked one last time, the bullet splitting a rider's hat from his head and burying itself in the mud, and then he stopped, breathing hard, shoulders rising and falling like the bellows of a forge, surrounded by the ruin of his own making. Around him the echoes began to fade, smoke curling upward like the spirit of everything lost, and in that haunting quiet that follows violence, one could almost hear it, the land, whispering its gratitude through the rain. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The world narrowed to a grammar of smoke and iron and the distant, impossible sound of a man breathing as if the air might betray him. Jedediah Crane felt the bullet like a punctuation, sharp, small, then a spreading blot that warmed his side and made the world tilt by inches, and he did not curse or stumble so much as lean into the burn. One hand braced on the scorched trail of the corral, the other holding the rifle like a prayer book against a wound. Around him the valley had become a moving painting of destruction. Men shouted in ragged cadences, horses screamed and scraped at the earth. The deputies' faces were pale, wet with rain and sweat, eyes blown wide by the sudden intimacy of death, and the barn behind him groaned as if remembering its first day in sunlight and choosing now to give itself up to heat. The shot that found him had come from somewhere in the swirl. Distance dissolved in smoke and the quick reflexes of men, and for a breath he tasted blood and dust, and the bitter of fear turned into something closer to resolve. The fire lit his face with an unsteady, holy light that made every drop of sweat and streak of ash look like medals won in a different war. And he thought not of dying but of the ledger he kept inside his ribs, promises, names, the small carved initial on a fence post that had taught a boy to swear by the land. Clay's voice cut through the chaos then, an order that tasted like pleading in the rain. Stand down. The command was not theatrical. There was no trumpet of mercy behind it, just the raw sound of a man who had reached the edge of what he could bear and decided to stop the world from spinning into further ruin. Deputies hesitated, some boots sliding in the mud, some hands tightening on straps as if at any second the shape of their fidelity might snap. One young man cried out and clutched a shoulder where a splinter had found flesh. and in the gap that opened the valley exhaled with 1,000 small sounds, water dripping from brim to boot, the hiss of embers, the distant lowing of cattle seeking shelter. Jed pressed his free hand against the wound to staunch the blood. It was hot and insistent and somehow honest, and the dirt under his fingernails was the same dirt his father had held when teaching a son to measure out a fence line. His breath came ragged but steady, each inhale a ledger line, each exhale a vowel recited again. He whispered, not to the men or the law but to the ghosts who had taught him the price of keeping faith. "Pa, I kept my word," and the syllables rode the air like a benediction, thin and sure. The firelight made saints of the smoke, carving halos from cinder, and in that light Judd's face was a map of choices. The stubble on his chin, the small, stubborn set of jaw, the eyes that had watched calves be born and friends be buried. Blood ran from the wound in his side and painted his shirt into a flag no clerk could register, and Martha's voice echoed inside his head as if she stood at his shoulder, calling him stubborn and brave in the same breath. Sheriff Clay dismounted and walked forward through mud and ash, his coat sodden, his star dull, and in his stride was the wear of a man who had decided that the measure of justice he wanted needed to bend to the measure of mercy he felt. He raised a hand in something like surrender or benediction, and the men around him, trained to follow and to obey, lowered their rifles as if a bell had tolled inside their chests. No one made a move to cuff Jed then. There was a kind of truce in that lowering of arms, a mutual recognition of what had been paid and what still might be owed. Jed sagged against the rail, breath wheezy and salt on his lips, eyes half closed against the heat that made the world swim in gold and charcoal. The pain was a drumbeat on his side, steady and honest, naming the cost of a choice made long ago. He did not plead for pity. He only steadied himself and watched the men around him rearrange into something less like execution and more like an accounting. And the rain, as if moved by the same conscience, began to fall a little harder, rinsing ash into the furrows and softening the sharp geometry of the day. In the quiet that followed the storm of bullets, where only the hiss of embers and the drip of water spoke, Jed thought of small things, the way his father had wrapped a hand around a young boy's shoulder, the smell of bread baking on a winter morning, the lazy, sure stop of Daisy's hoofs, and he felt, beneath the iron and the hurt, a fierce and grateful peace, as if a man can lose much and still keep the ledger of what matters. The valley, patient and old, watched them, and while men counted loss and law, Jed kept his promise like a light in his chest and let the blood and the wind write the rest. Clay walked as if his boots remembered other marshes, slower now, the gait of a man pried between duty and something older. And every step toward Jedediah Crane felt like a page being turned in a book he loved but could not save. The smoke still braided through the morning and the ash lay soft like gray snow on Jed's shoulders, his shirt a dark map of blood and grit. And when Clay came near, he didn't reach for a weapon or for a warrant, but for the warrant placed inside his coat where paper and pen had once felt like justice instead of a guillotine. Jed's rifle slid from his fingers with the tired grace of a man who has shot his last shot, and it thudded into the mud not as surrender but as an offering. Metal and wood in the measured honesty of a life's tools set down because a man had already done what he needed to do. For a thin breathing second the world narrowed to the two of them and the crackle of the fire. And Jed looked at Clay with an expression like rain on old tin. Soft, weary, unafraid, he said, voice ragged and true, "You can hang me, Sheriff, but you'll never take my land." The words were small in the wide air yet landed like a judge's gavel, final and unavoidable, ringing with the weight of promises and of a plain sort of courage that needs no drum. Deputies shifted, on knees moving through their ranks like wind through hay, and a few townsfolk who had crept near were watched with hands over mouths as if to muffle the sound of something breaking. Clay's face rearranged itself, first like a man hearing a sermon he'd written then regretted, then like a mourner recognizing the inevitable in a friend's eyes, and he raised neither voice nor weapon. Instead he steadied himself and, with a motion that was almost reverent, called his men back as if withdrawing them from the edge of a cliff. "Hold, stand down." The command fell not from authority but from mercy, and the men obeyed, lowering rifles like guilty priests letting go of doctrine they could not reconcile with the sight before them. One deputy hesitated, weirdly alive to the contradiction, then turned, his hands trembling, as if putting his trust in a different kind of order. Clay reached Jed slowly, and he did not manacle him with the clumsy roughness of a jailer. He took the cuffs from his belt with hands that trembled not from cold but from the knowledge of what he was about to do, and when he closed them around Jed's wrists his touch was careful, and almost gentling, fingers pressing as if to test whether the man was still warm and human, not merely a name on a decree. There was no clang of triumph, only the quiet click like a hinge finding its place, and in that sound lay more grief than any shouted victory could ever hold. Jed did not fight. He offered his wrists as a man offers the last of his harvest, without resentment and with a strange dignity, the way one hands over a family Bible to be laid on a coffin. Around them the valley seemed to fold inward, the sky holding its breath, the fire casting long, loping shadows that made everyone look older and smaller and harder to bear the sight of. Clay's badge caught the light and looked dull and heavy, an object that had been used to command and now had to be used to contain. And when he secured the last cuff, he looked Jed in the eye as a friend might, and the look they shared was a conversation without words, a ledger closed, a benediction, a question with no answer. "I'm sorry, Jed," Clay said. The apology a stone dropped into a well. Jed's smile came like the exhale of a man who had long ago stopped weighing his days by consequence and begun to weigh them by fidelity. He nodded once, small and stoic, and managed, "You did what you had to." Sorrow sat on the faces of both men like dust not yet settled. The deputies formed a line to take Jed away, but did so with the solemnity of pallbearers, their steps muffled in mud, their mouths set against the thunder of their own consciences. Martha, who had ridden out with hope and grim determination, pressed her hat to her chest and could not look as the man she had loved stood handcuffed, not for theft or violence, but for the stubborn crime of loving soil. Children who had come to see the spectacle withdrew, their cheeks streaked with ash and rain, understanding in a way adults sometimes don't that something sacred had been lost. Jed walked between the deputies with dignity and tact, his shoulders square despite the cuffs, and as they led him toward town the sheriff kept his hat off, holding it to his heart like one keeps a wound warm. There was no cheering, no vindication, only the raw, honest ache of shared loss, and in that ache the valley learned a new truth. Law could be enforced, titles could be signed, men could be punished, but certain debts were written in blood and memory, and they were not easily paid. Dawn came thin and gray, a pale thing that could not quite wash the night from the valley, and the remains of Jedediah Crane's life smoked in tame curls from the bones of his barn, each whiff carrying soot like a small, stubborn memory. The charred rafters lay like broken ribs across a field once loud with cattle and laughter, and the air tasted of fashioned old iron, a flavor that settled in the mouths of the few who lingered to watch what loss looks like at morning. Railroad men fanned out over the blackened earth, boot soles scuffing at glassy clods as if eager to find purchase where roots had once held, and the foreman, short, hard-eyed, the kind of man who measures worth in cartloads and contracts, stooped and slapped his palm against the ground with an impatience that was almost obscene, cursing the ruin with language meant to make the disappointment sting less. "This land's useless now," he spat, the words thrown like trash into the open air. A deputy muttered something about salvage, about rails being rerouted and insurance, and men whose business sense had been taught in boardrooms nodded, already balancing losses in columns only they could see. But Sheriff Clay stood a little apart, saddle creaking beneath him as he watched the smoke lift, and the valley seemed to take back a breath it hadn't known it had been holding. His expression was unreadable, a map of past and present sketched into a face that had been steady through shootings and storms. And when the foreman's curse echoed off scorched posts, Clay dismounted with the slow, respectful economy of a man who knows some things demand to be done without haste. He walked the blackened line, boots sinking slightly where the fire had softened earth into a grave of ash, and the foreman followed, trying to press his measure of ruin into Clay's hands like a contract. "Salvage the rails here, push the grade a touch farther, we'll cut losses." Clay listened, the paper in his pocket heavy with law and the town's expectations, and when at last he answered, his voice carried the tired cadence of someone who had watched too many good things get priced and sold. "Guess it belongs to nobody, then." The sentence was not triumphant, it fell flat and honest, a kind of arithmetic that neither man wanted to do but both understood. If a place is burned, if its memory is scorched, who has the claim to it beyond the ink that names it? The foreman's jaw worked, profit and pride fought for air in his expression, and the deputies shifted, the machinery of order trying to find the gear that would make sense of a moral calculus. Townsfolk gathered in loose knots at a distance, women with aprons still pinned, men with sleeves rolled, children with faces smudged by fascination and fear, and Martha stood among them, a woman carved by seasons and sorrow, hat in hand, eyes dry but full of a grief that did not need loudness to be true. She watched the foreman and the men scratch plans in the dirt with boots and curses while the sheriff's words seemed to rearrange the day into a different kind of accounting. Some debts cannot be settled with timber or coin. Clay mounted slowly, the motion deliberate, and for a brief, private instant he looked toward where the graves of Judd's kin had long ago been set, a thin line of stones half swallowed by grass, and he felt the old promise of belonging press against him like a question without an answer. He did not speak further. He touched his hat to his chest, a small, lonely salute to a man whose shoulders had been broader in memory than in this moment. And then his horse moved, hoofs stirring ash that rose like small ghosts and hung to the saddle. The wind lifted, carrying with it the twin scents of ash and justice, mingled and indistinguishable for a breath. Justice that had been carried out and ash that had been paid. As Clay rode away, the town watched him go. Some faces hardened into the neat lines of relief that come when local order is restored. Others slackened into something softer, a recognition of cost that money could not cancel. Children followed until the sheriff's horse was a dot on the ridge, and then, like a curtain drawn, life resumed its slow, uncertain script. The saloon door swung, chickens scattered. A bell from the church rang thin and small, but under that ordinary hum lay the quiet truth the valley had learned. Land remembers what men forget, and sometimes the law's ledger does not hold the debts that root a family to a place. Smoke rose still from the wreckage, a small stubborn column that refused to be hurried away, and in its slow ascent Jed's name seemed to ride the wind, not as accusation but as story. And Dust Valley carried the memory of him in the hush between hoofbeats and prayers. In the way fences still leaned toward the old homestead, as if paying their own kind of tribute to a man who would not be bought. Jed sat on the narrow cot of a dim cell where light came through a high-barred window like a thin, solemn line, and he rode with hands calloused by fence and plow. Careful as a man mending a broken gate, he did not write a last speech but a list of small mercies, how to mend the gate by the north spring, which helmet a prune, where the well kept its clearest water, because a life lived in land is measured in particulars, and he wanted Martha to have those maps. He folded a paper that smelled faintly of smoke and rain, and, with a pencil that left the shaky trail, he wrote about work and memory rather than death. Feed the mares in late frost, mend the south fence after storms, read the Bible on Sundays so the kids know how the words go. He tucked in a line that was more prayer than instruction. If a man's heart can take root in the soil, maybe that's what makes it sacred, and he meant it as both comfort and covenant. Guards came and took him to the gallows with the quiet that comes from towns used to carrying out judgment. He walked steady, not because he hated life but because he loved something that was not for sale. And on the scaffold he faced the crowd with the same patient honesty that had guided him in pasture and plow. After the rope did its work and the vigil broke, Sheriff Clay sat alone in his office with Jet's folded letter in his palm. The paper now a weight that touched memory, not just law. He read the tidy instructions and the single soft line about roots, and the words struck him with a tenderness that made his eyes wet. Jed had not cursed, had not begged. He had given care for what would come after. Clay did not speak. He folded the letter back into itself and let the silence fill the room like cash. The note moved through town then, hands turning pages at kitchen tables and porches, and Martha followed Jet's small directions as if performing a sacrament. She repaired the gate, pruned the elm where the children played shadow, kept the well rope oiled in November, and read aloud on Sundays so those young ears would learn the cadence of steady things. In doing the work she kept more than tasks. She kept Jet's intent in it alive, the idea that the land could hold a man's heart like a root holds a tree. Years later, saplings pushed through ash where the barn had been, and a thin green thread stitched the hollow back to life, and locals would say Jet's last words planted a crop of another kind, memory that refused to be bought. Clay kept the folded letter in his coat pocket for a long time, the creases wearing soft under his thumb. When the wind smelled of rain he would finger it and think of Jed's slow, steady gait. Here again the voice that had saved him once in a different fight. The paper became both burden and blessing to the sheriff, a reminder that law can be carried without understanding all the heart it touches. And he read the line about roots as if it were scripture. In quiet evenings, some men at the tavern spoke of the day as judgment done, others as tragedy. Children asked what made land sacred, and mothers repeated Judd's line like a lullaby, that a man's heart, if planted, can make the soil holy. The valley kept the story in its fences and in the slow curl of grass over the old foundation. And in that keeping was a kind of victory Judd had wanted, not for himself but for the future. an insistence that what you love with your whole stubborn life cannot be erased by ink alone. Years later, the valley learned to breathe again in a slower key. Green pushed up through char, and like a stubborn prayer, the first tufts of grass took hold where the barn had been, softening the hard black lines into something most gentle, and life returned in small, patient measures. The croak of frogs by the spring, a fox slipping along the fence line, caves nosing new shoots where ash had once lain. In the center of that slow reclamation stood a single stone, modest and rough-cut, its letters chased by lichen and wind, Jedediah Crane. He stood for what couldn't be bought, and folks who passed by tipped hats or paused, children tugging hands toward the name as if pulled by a rope tied to curiosity. Martha kept to the homestead with the stubbornness of an old oak, tending the wells and mending the fence posts just as Jed had written, her hands steady as scripture, her laugh rare but full when the harvest came in even from a smaller yield, and she read aloud the rules he'd left: prune the elm, oil the well pulley, feed the mares in cold. And in those small acts the ranch kept its covenant, a ledger of chores turned into ritual, a way to make memory practical and impossible to evict. The town aged around that memory too. The saloon took on a frosting of gray at its corners, new faces came and went with the seasons, and Sheriff Clay grew older in a different way, one marked by a quieter gait and the habit of touching the folded letter in his pocket when a wind came from the ridge. Sometimes he would ride up to the gravestone and stand a long while with no show of ceremony, just a man in a rock in the kind of silence that knows what it toes. Children who had been too young to see the burning learned the story in fragments, an old man who would not sell, a barn that made a pyre, a sheriff who put away his gun and carried a grief like a coat, and as they grew they repeated it in different keys. Some said Jed was foolish, some said he was noble, but most learned the simpler truth that the grown people around them wore in their faces. There are debts paper cannot balance. The rails did indeed come, as they always do, but there was a quiet line in the earth where the tracks stopped short of Dust Valley, a slight curving away as if iron itself had hesitated and chosen not to cross a boundary drawn in memory rather than on a map. Engineers signed papers and foremen cursed and budgets were redrawn. But from time to time a conductor would slow the train as it neared the ridge and tip his hat out the window toward the lone stone, a gesture small and human against the machinery of commerce. Stories clustered around the homestead like swallows, some true, some embroidered with the soft edges of time, and travelers stopping by would hear the tale told in taverns and at kitchen tables as if passing down a family recipe. Jed stood, they would say, and his stand bent the road. They'd point to the last sleep of the rails, where ties ended and the horizon opened like an unmade promise. Farmers who had once considered selling a corner here or a strip there found themselves reconsidering. Something of Jed's stubbornness had seeped into the soil and into the town's memory, making a subtle moral ledger that accounted for more than profit. On certain afternoons the wind carries the smell of steel and oil from the distant line, and then, beneath it, the softer scent of grass and cured hay. And if you stand on the ridge and listen long enough you can hear the valley's two rhythms, one the slow ticking of seasons, the other the faint, mechanical chug of a world that tried to pass through and paused, then turned. A narrator's voice, the kind that tells you what you already feel, might say, soft and steady, out here, men die, dreams fade, and dust settles. But land remembers, and in that remembering there is no need victory, no billboard pronouncement, only small reckonings, a child taught the right way to repair a fence, a widow given a plank to mend a roof, a sheriff who carries a paper that folded him into grief and humanness both. The valley keeps those reckonings like rings in a tree, concentric and honest, and every spring those rings push up green and new, making sure that Jed's name is not a punctuation but a continued sentence, something the earth reads and understands. And so the legacy of Dust Valley is not one monument or moment but a habit of being, to measure value by what roots and resist spying, to hold fast when it's necessary, and to pass on, in work and story, the small rituals that make a place sacred. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.